It's Play-Doh. I'm not going to eat it.
That's the moment.
It doesn't taste good at all. They added something that makes it gross.
The Senate will please come to order. Today we'll have a moment of silence to begin the day. Thank you. I'll remind the senator from Windsor, if you can turn off your microphone, that would be appreciated. Or we'll do it here. Thank you. Are there any announcements? Seeing none, we have two bills to refer that are on the notice calendar. The first being H127, affecting the revenues of the state, will be committed to the Committee on Finance, and H178, also affecting the revenues of the state, will be referred to the Committee on Finance under Rule 31. We have a Senate bill for introduction, S146. It was introduced by the Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. As such, it will be placed on the calendar for, please listen to the first reading of the bill.
S146, an act relating to the permitting of indirect discharges.
Now you've heard the first reading of the bill. It'll be referred to the calendar for notice. We have two House bills for reference, the first being H488, introduced by Representative Nickel. Please listen to the first reading of the bill.
H488, an act relating to approval of the adoption of the Charter of the Town of Ludlow.
And according to rules, the bill will be referred to the Rules Committee. We now have H495, introduced by Representative Shai and others. Please listen to the first reading of the bill.
H495, an act relating to the approval of the amendment to the Charter of the Town of Middlebury.
This bill, also not having met crossover, will be referred to the Committee on Rules. That brings us to the orders of the day. We have up for consideration second reading of H35, which was reported to the Committee on Judiciary, which is considered the same and recommends that the bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H35, an act relating to the Victims Assistance Program.
Now for the report from the Committee on Judiciary, the Senator from Franklin, Senator Norris.
Thank you, Mr. President. H35 is being passed out, as most bills are. We'll report them on the second reading. It's a very lengthy bill. It's 2.5 pages. Those are the bills that I take. The bill proposes to move the Victims Assistance Program from the Center for Crime Victim Services to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, to make changes to the services provided to victims under the program, and to change the name of the Victim Advocate Program. Now for the bill, Section 1, Victims Assistance Program. This section changes the responsibility for maintaining the Victims Assistance Program from the Center of Crime Victim Services to the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs. The title of the program is changed from the Victims Assistance Program to Victim Advocate Program. Subdivisions A1-3 set forth the responsibilities of the program. The bill makes small changes to the services offered to better reflect the current services offered by the program. Section 2, Victims Advocate. Before I go any further on this, I'd just like to briefly explain to the body, if they don't already know, or the Senate, that what a victim advocate is and what they do. And their duties are many, I might add, but I'll just do a quick overview. Per statute, as evidenced in 13 VSA 5304, every state's attorney's office in Vermont has a victim advocate. Currently, there are 27 victim advocates, with the larger counties having more than one, and some are highly specialized in dealing with domestic violence and sexual violence cases. I am sure you recall this from your connection. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to read that part. That was a mistake on my part. There'll be many. Victims advocates in this capacity become involved when a crime has been reported, probable cause has been found, and the prosecutor has decided to move the case forward. Victims advocate, just a brief of what they do. They work with the victim throughout the entire process. They ensure the victim is provided with information and notification, because not all of them are very familiar with what happens within our judicial systems, obviously. They assist victims with filing claims for victims' compensation and restitution. They assist victims with completing a victim impact statement. They ensure the victim has a voice in the negotiation of any plea agreement. They assist the victim with connecting with the Department of Corrections to sign up for notifications to assist them with coordinating with the state agency relative to executing their rights. And finally, provide notification in some post-conviction matters, such as early discharge from probation. Section 3, this act shall take effect upon passage. This bill came out on a unanimous vote of 5-0-0, and I apologize, I do not have the list of witnesses, but I can provide that before third reading. There was, I believe, 3 or 4 of them, but I'll provide that before third reading. Having said that, we ask the Senate for their support. Thank you.
Now, you've heard the report of the bill. Question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the reporter?
The reporter is interrogated.
Mr. President, on the Transportation Committee, we talk a lot about the need for transportation just for daily needs, jobs, medical appointments. I see that the victim advocate will not be providing transportation as it was before. Now that's stricken, so I just wondered what the reasoning was.
Thank you, Mr. President. This was an older bill that came into fruition, in, I believe it was in 1994, with the help of our now retired senator. And as far as the transportation of victims involved in cases, it was put in there for just a case, so to speak, but it never happened. It never came to fruition where the Victims Advocates Programs never transported individuals to and from those individual cases. So they saw no need to have this remain within the bill.
Thank you.
Question, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? Okay, so all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. Aye. Those the ayes have it. You have ordered third reading of S-835. We now have under consideration S-39. S-39 is the first time we first read it, which considered saying and recommended that when amended the bill ought pass. The bill of Democratic and Appropriations also considered saying and recommended when further amended that bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
S39, an act relating to compensation and benefits for members of the Vermont General Assembly.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report. For the report from the Committee on Government Operations, the Senator from Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is an honor to be able to present on S39. This is a bill that resets legislative compensation and our benefits package for the first time in over 20 years for our General Assembly. The bill originated in your humble Senate Government Operations Committee. On a vote of 6-0-0, we asked the chamber to support this bill. Now, I'm going to do two things for you today in my floor report. First, I will describe the financial barriers and other challenges that catalyzed the introduction of this bill. And then second, I will take us section by section through the bill itself and its multiple components. For that first point, if you look back in Vermont history, you'll see that this is not the first time our body or our chamber has discussed legislative compensation or pay. We've contemplated this on numerous occasions, and in fact, the role of public servants in general in this General Assembly. In fact, I would encourage the chamber to review the Vermont Constitution, where if you were to turn to section, as I will now, if you were to turn to page 38 and section 61, I'm just going to read to you that part of the general provision because I think it illustrates the conversation that we're having today. It reads, as all persons of full age to preserve their independence, if without a sufficient estate, ought to have some profession, calling, trade, or farm, whereby they may honestly subsist, There can be no necessity for nor use in establishing offices of profit, the usual effects of which are dependence and servility, unbecoming of free citizens in the possessors or expectance and faction, contention and discord among the people. So that begins a very important section that I want us to pay attention to today. And here's the additional section. But if any person who is called to public service to the prejudice of that person's private affairs, the person has a right to reasonable compensation. So I'm going to talk about those two concepts. So hold in your head the idea of any person called into public service. This is a calling. And then also the right to reasonable compensation. What is reasonable compensation? So we asked that question in your Senate Government Operations Committee. What is reasonable compensation? As many of you experienced at the end of last session, over 30% of legislators across all three major political parties decided not to run for re-election. While the pandemic had created that wave of retirements in part, or job changes across the very employment sectors, many legislators saw the job as unsustainable for people trying to support themselves or their families. This exposed that reoccurring conversation and an issue within the structure of our state legislators' pay and benefits. At the same time that we know that information, that we know about that exodus of legislators, our committee also took testimony from state representatives who continue to experience the financial barrier and the inability to continue to serve moving forward. We also heard robustly from Vermonters who want to serve, who dream of serving, who feel called to serve. But the financial barrier, the ability to pencil out the numbers, isn't there for them to be a part of our democracy. We heard that they were called to serve, but they couldn't leave a full-time job because the numbers didn't pencil out, and that they would lose access to basic benefits like health insurance. We often hear that Vermont prides itself as a citizen legislature, where everyday Vermonters can go to Montpelier, they can solve problems and pass laws, and over those few months, they can do that and then return to their jobs and go back to their families. But many younger people and those who are under retirement age can't afford the low legislative pay and the lack of benefits, and can't do it on top of balancing an already difficult conversation with employers where you're asking them to serve for any period of time outside of your work. So S39 looks at the fact that Vermont needs and benefits from a diverse, dedicated legislator that is filled with Vermonters of varied backgrounds and professions, and that we make better policy when we actually have different kinds of perspectives in the room. I mean, we all know this. We know if you have diverse voices in a democracy, you get better policy. So we wanted to be able to have every Vermonter have the ability to afford to be a part of our democracy. So S39 increases the salary of state legislators to the equivalent of the average salary earned in Vermont. That feels like reasonable compensation. Currently, state legislators earn around $14,000 for the 4.5 months or so of service that we have in the session. S39, and I'll note there is an appropriations amendment that I'll be referring to, it increases the amount to around $20,500 by 2027. A very important point to make. This bill does not impact our current legislative pay. It only does so for future legislators. So we don't have to get reelected to actually get any of the benefit of this bill, other than the health insurance piece that I'll discuss later. This bill would also provide for 1 day of pay per week for legislators outside of session during those 7.5 months that we're not here. And that would compensate us for the currently unpaid work that we do, where we meet with constituents, respond to emails. Don't know if you've gotten any emails about any bills, but I tend to respond to a lot of emails during the session and out of session because our constituents expect us to be available to them throughout the year, because the title doesn't go away when the doors shut in May at some point. So taken together, the increase of in-session pay plus the added off-session pay would bring legislative compensation up to around $29,000 annually by 2028, or that another way to put it is that's a prorated version of the average Vermont salary, which in 2023 is around $56,000 a year. So this level of compensation would also allow the Vermont legislature to be around the average, because we're right now below the average for other state legislators. So nationally, we are below the average of pay for other state legislators, and this would bring us to right around a little bit below the average still. By both measures, that would show us that the Vermont legislature with this bill would simply be paid an average amount. No increase would take effect until 2025 after the next election year, meaning the current legislators here who are voting on the bill would not benefit from the pay increase unless reelected. Importantly, S39 would also provide legislators access to health insurance on the same terms as state employees. We did not want to give ourselves a richer benefit than state employees. So the health insurance benefit that I'll describe further in the section by section is tied to what state employees currently get. So while over 95% of Vermonters have health insurance coverage of some form, many state legislators do not. This is a barrier for many people's ability to run for state office, especially if they would lose their health insurance coverage, which happens, because they're taking time away from their full-time job. Meaning the time you take off to do this job disqualifies you for access to your employer's health insurance plan. That's a difficult decision. So what are the components of the bill that move us forward towards that better, healthy democracy that I reiterated earlier? So I direct you to page 1343 in your calendar today, where you'll see the sections of the bill. As you can see, there is a soon-to-be-coming Appropriations Committee amendment in your calendar, and there are some sections and subsections of this bill removed or phased in differently that I will be referring to as our committee voted favorably or supports the Appropriations Amendment. So, Mr. Speaker, I will now be speaking towards the different section by section. Mr. President, I will now be speaking towards the sections of the bill. You've also, I believe, been handed out a fiscal note. That fiscal note includes the Appropriations Amendment, and I see that folks have that. So let's go to section 1. It is the reimbursement for professional development activities when approved by the Speaker of the House or the pro tem. Note this was removed by the Appropriations Amendment, although I do love the National Conference of State Legislators, and no matter what, I hope future legislators do choose to attend. Section 2, as reflected in your fiscal note, adds the General Assembly to the definition of employee as it is related to the state's health insurance policy. It ties us to that plan and the premium split that the state employees are offered to the executive branch. This is currently an 80-20 split that would be made available to legislators. Additionally, we get access to something called the Employee Assistance Program, EAP. If you've ever struggled with a mental health crisis or a housing situation, EAP is a service that gives you access to support and a resource, which I'm sure many of us would appreciate just generally as employees. This resource we also have a flexible spending account in this section of the bill, the FSA, which would look at healthcare and dependent care expenses. Section 3, this is our compensation-related intent, and you've noticed I've said a few times that we're looking to tie ourselves to the average Vermont wage. We wanted to call that out very clearly in our intent because as I look back in history when coming up with this report, I'm sure future legislators will also look back to our intent. Section 4, this is the meat of it. It is the Speaker of the House and the Senate Pro Tem's compensation reset. It would be going from $898.44 per session week to $1,340 per session week, and then annually that goes from around $13,891 to $20,716. You'll look out for more on this in the appropriations amendment, as there was some clarification there, but generally the same concept of increasing the compensation there. It also includes reimbursement for expenses for child care, dependent, and elder care. Section 5, this is the General Assembly compensation reset, and that's for everyone other than the Speaker of the House and the Senate Pro Tem. It also has special session compensation included. So we have adjournment compensation, which would add that we are entitled to that 1/5 of our annual adjusted weekly salary off session. The compensation then extends to the time spent preparing for meetings or of special joint committees, in addition to that weekly adjournment compensation that was removed by the appropriations amendment, and it continues to, we remain to have our expenses. So that is meals, room, and mileage reimbursement. These sections also allow members to choose between making an allowance for or reimbursement. So that would be where you submit your receipts for reimbursement rather than take it as a stipend amount. So some of you might be familiar with that concept from other employment situations. So that's to avoid someone from submitting receipts, then changing back and forth week after week. We really support our legislative operations folks who make this work happen, and that was a recommendation that we don't have folks swap back and forth between receipts, stipend. We don't want to cause more work. That would be submitted in writing to the Director of Legislative Operations. The next section looks at child dependent and elder care reimbursement. I'm not going to spend time here because the Appropriations Committee removed that section, but I'm happy to speak to it if folks have concerns. Fifth, we also had parking. We heard from members of the we heard from folks in the General Assembly who are differently abled and were paying out of pocket to cover parking expenses. So that means someone with a disability who serves is paying more than someone who does not have a disability to serve. So we wanted to not have that situation occur, and we put that in the bill. That was removed from the appropriations amendment. Going on to section 6, we extend the protections for legislative leave to part-time employment. This has been a bit of a loophole where employers who you get protection for serving as a legislature if you're a full-time employee, but not if you're a part-time employee. And it also changes the date of notice to the employer from within 10 days after filing primary nomination petitions to within 14 days of being elected. Section 7 is the creation of the working group on the topic of legislative service in our General Assembly. Again, your humble Senate Government Operations Committee heard a lot about how we function as a legislature. And there were questions that we wrestled with that we didn't feel that we could take a position on without really delving into it. And that's the point of the working group that I'm going to describe. The working group has membership that includes 3 current House members, 3 current senators, and not all from the same political party. House members would be appointed by the Speaker, senators appointed by the Committee on Committees. The working group will take a look at recommendations on staffing, benefits, compensation, length of the legislative session, and that would include a few sections, whether the current salaries and benefits are sufficient or if they should be increased, what the impact on recruiting and retaining membership from folks with diverse backgrounds or lived experiences would look like, whether we should offer a more generous child dependent and elder care expense benefit, whether members should be able to receive a prorated salary throughout the calendar year, perhaps, compared to the months we served during the session. And another question is whether those in leadership should have additional compensation like the Speaker Pro Tem, caucus leaders, committee chairs, perhaps. And we also ask to have a comparison between other states when it comes to salary, benefits, and compensation structure. We look at whether or not the staffing is actually reasonable to meet the needs of the legislature and how we would go about making those changes, whether that would be increasing the size of state offices, adding additional personal staff, caucus staff, or legislative staff services. And we ask how we would increase administrative support to increase the effectiveness and ability for us to respond to our constituents. And again, we look at the length and structure of the legislative session. This will all be administered with the technical and legal guidance of our fantastic legislative operations, legislative counsel, and Office of Human Resources folks, and Joint Fiscal Office. And the report is due on or before January 15th, 2024, to make recommendations to the Speaker, the Pro Tem, House Government Operations and General Affairs, the Senate Government Operations Committee, and we have those meetings beginning July 1st of 2023 and ceasing by January 15th, 2024. So, Mr. President, we know that Vermonters benefit from a legislature that has dedicated itself to service. And they want us to make the time that we need to do our work thoughtfully and effectively during our session and the rest of the year. This bill creates that study committee to consider the changes that make our legislature even more sustainable for senators, representatives, and for our constituents, while tying it to that average Vermont salary. So I'm going to end with our last two sections, which is Section 8, which is the appropriations section, and you can find out more in the fiscal note. As it was in the original fiscal note, we were looking at $875,000 for fiscal year 2024. That number is slightly adjusted and updated in the most recent fiscal note, and you will hear more about that again from appropriations. So the last section is the effective dates, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the effective dates because we wanted to be clear that current elected folks would not be seeing the benefit of that compensation piece yet. So Section 6 and Section 7 take effect, oops, I flipped too early, take effect on passage. Section 8, July 1st of 2023. Section 2A, 3, and 5B through D, January 1st of 2024. Section 1 would be July 1st of 2024, and all remaining sections, January 1st of 2025. I'm going to now give you our witness list and then have one minor concluding note. So we heard from multiple House representatives from different parties. That included Representative Ashley Bartley, Representative Michelle Boslin, Representative Troy Hedrick, Representative Emma Mulvaney Stanek. We also heard from former legislators, former legislator Felicia Loeffler, and we heard from Jennifer Carby, Daniel Dickerson, Arlene Donovan, Director of Office of Legislative Human Resources, Beth Fasigi, Commissioner of Department of Human Resources, Mike Ferrant, Director of Office of Legislative Operations. We heard from Eric Hofel, Change Management Specialist and Vision Support for the Department of Finance and Management. We heard from Steve Howard, the Executive Director of the Vermont State Employees Association. And we heard from Jocelyn Williams, Policy Specialist for the Center for Strengthening, for Legislative Strengthening from the National Conference of State Legislators. So as you can see, we heard from a long list of competent and qualified witnesses. Serving in the Vermont legislature is not supposed to be a career, but it's also not supposed to be a job that only wealthy or retired folks can afford to do. We want the average Vermonter to have the ability to serve when they are called to serve. We want them to be of all ages, all backgrounds, family configurations, and to be able to run and serve when they're in office. To make that a reality, we need to protect that right to reasonable compensation, as we heard outlined in our own Constitution. And our state will be better off if we give everyone a chance to have a seat at the table for our democracy. Thank you, and that concludes my floor report.
The bill came to the floor and affecting the expenditures of the state was referred to the Committee on Appropriations. Now for the report on Committee Appropriations, Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank my colleague from Windsor. I thought that was an excellent presentation, and it gets at the meat of the issue before us today. When I was sworn in as President Pro Tem, I called this a new Senate, and indeed it is. If you look around the room, we are not the Senate we were even 2 years ago. And that's for two reasons. First of all, we had 10 new members come in, and we lost some people that I really, really love. Josh Terenzini, Corey Parent, Chris Pearson, to name three. All three of them told us and told the media that part of the reason they were leaving, a big part, was that they had young families that were expensive, and their ability to serve here was dependent on making enough to square the circle. They couldn't do that, and so reluctantly they left. Now I'm a glass half full kind of guy, so I believe that one day all three of them will be back. Make some money, come back. But with that said, I would like to point out that our current benefit and pay structure leaves out, as my colleague said, a large portion of Vermont society. If you go around the building, you see people of a certain similar type, and that is people often who are retired, people who are in jobs that allow them the flexibility to be here. So I want to thank the Government Operations Committee for getting their arms around this issue and for having the courage to bring it to the floor. And I just want to talk about that courage for a minute. After we discuss this, there's going to be a vote. And we're all going to have to vote yes or no because that's what our jobs are. And it's a very, very difficult thing to raise compensation and benefits for this chamber. Now, to stress, none of the money is going to come to the people in this particular legislature. So what the appropriations did, among other things, was to phase the incoming bump in compensation over not one biennium, but two. So anybody sitting in this room would have to serve 5 more years to get the full compensation under the appropriations amendment. You would have to be reelected not once, but twice. So that was deliberate, and the idea is to make it clear that our eyes are on future legislatures and future senators' ability to serve, not necessarily our own financial situation at this moment. With that said, I'd like to just point out that this bill had a somewhat unusual path in that as President Pro Tem, I went around and talked with small groups of senators, making sure that I was hearing from everybody. People didn't commit to the bill, but they gave input. And that's important because we are senators of 3 parties, but we are all colleagues in this room. All of us operate under the same permanent rules. We all receive compensation and benefits that are outlined in statute. So I wanted to make sure that we were hearing from everybody. And having done that, I funneled that information into the Appropriations Committee, and we discussed and we came up with the amendment that you see in your calendar starting on page 1353. But before we go to that language, what I'll ask you to do is look at the grid that was passed out to you with some highlighted yellow elements. And again, I thank my colleague from Windsor who generated this document. I just highlighted. So at a glance, anything in yellow has been struck in the appropriations amendment. So what that in general does is it leaves the big impact items, the things that we think will help the most individuals serve in this chamber. Those have been left in the appropriations amendment, and the committee was strongly behind them. The things in yellow we thought were smaller scale, smaller bore, and could be thought included within those larger compensation bumps. So for instance, you'll notice that money to prepare for meetings has been struck in the amendment. Child dependent and elder care, which was a reimbursement up to $1,600, has been struck. The parking piece has been struck. That, by the way, is something we're attempting to deal with House and Senate leadership through another avenue. Professional development money has been struck. We have left, starting on the left column, the ability for senators to buy into the state health care plan under the same terms that state employees enjoy. You'll see weekly pay in session is bumped for senators. It is also bumped for the Speaker of the House and the Senate President Pro Tem. And you'll see the note there on the left. Inadvertently, I was told by the Government Operations Committee that differential had been reduced. JFO came to us and asked us if that was the intent. Constitutional officers currently have a certain differential, and so that differential is preserved in the appropriation amendment. You'll notice off-session compensation, and this is an area that some people needed to think through, because we haven't been paid for the off-session other than per diems and expenses for meetings that you put in for. The thinking there, and I like the senator from Windsor's line, the title doesn't go away. You are still a senator 365 days a year. Those of us who have been in the chamber a long time know that when an emergency happens, when a tropical storm Irene happens, when a COVID epidemic happens, suddenly you are activated in the off-session willy-nilly. You have no choice in the matter. And even if there's no emergency, everyone has your number, literally. Everyone calls you, everyone sends you emails, and you are invited to everything, everywhere that anyone is doing. So all of us, we believe, the Appropriations Committee and the GovOps Committee, would benefit from some compensation for that. And I think what the Government Operations Committee landed on was a good amount. 1 day of pay in the off session that will be received as a stipend, and that will be added to the overall yearly compensation. So with all of that said, we preserved the language of the Government Operations Committee. They did fine, careful work. So our work in appropriations was mostly trimming down the menu of things that were being proposed and phasing in the compensation over not one future biennium, but 2 future bienniums. Now, if I might, Mr. President, I'd like to just say a word about the media's role in all of this, because they have. You remember when the new Senate was sworn in, there was a flurry of stories, very concerned stories, that we were losing people, interviewing people who were younger, who had different needs, and I found those stories convincing and sympathetic. And so did the Government Operations Committee, and they acted on them. And I'm asking that we act today on the Appropriations Amendment. But you see the cameras behind me. There will be stories tomorrow that say legislators voted to raise their own pay. They won't be true. They won't be true. Because we're not voting to raise our pay, we're voting to raise the pay of the next legislature and the one after that. But with that said, I'm going to hold tight to what the media said first in January, that we were in a bind generationally speaking, and we needed to find a way out of it. I believe the Government Operations Committee has done that. The Appropriations Committee has seconded the most important pieces of that work. And I think if we put it into action, we will have a legislature, as my colleague noted, that is more democratic, more representative, and more effective as a result. Thank you, Mr. President. Happy to answer questions. Our vote out of committee was 7-0-0.
So the question is, shall the report of the Committee on Government Operations be amended as offered by the Committee on Appropriations? Are you ready for that question? Senator from Essex.
Mr. President, is this a proper place to amend the amendment from this Appropriations Committee?
My understanding is that you'll be your amendment would be after this vote, when depending on the outcome either way, the Government Operations report, either as an amendment to the underlying bill or as amended to the underlying bill, that question would be asked, and that is how the place that your amendment is referenced to be attempted.
Thank you, Mr. President.
That'll be clear to everybody else in a moment. Question is, shall the report of the Committee on Government Operations be amended as offered by the Committee on Appropriations? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have amended the report of the Committee on Government Operations as offered by the Committee on Appropriations. Question now is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Government Operations as amended? Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I look around the chamber after having 10 new senators join us, and I'm very pleased to see that we seem to have a younger crowd. I look across the state, and I look that we still have 20,000 jobs unfilled, but I look through the chambers of 180 seats, and I see no empty seats. It seems to be that we don't really have a problem of filling the seats in both of these chambers. In fact, we seem to have some winners and losers. A lot of people have ran and they didn't win. But I do recognize that that it could be a little problematic for some to come and join. So I've put an amendment forward that is being passed out now. And the amendment basically is, I want to make sure that all members of the Senate and the House receive $1,500 a week. And the way that we get there is by not raising the amount of monies that we're appropriating for that, is that we just shorten our session. And I have proposed that we shorten the session to 13 weeks. And that the savings between the 5 weeks that we're no longer serving and the compensation that we receive for per diems for mileage, meals, and rooms would more than make up the difference to compensate lawmakers fairly for the $1,500 a week that I propose. It's not a foreign idea that we could do this quicker. There's 11 states that actually serve for 90 days or less already in the United States, and some of them don't even get compensated as much as what we're proposing here. But again, I think that we could fairly do $1,500 a week for 13 weeks, keep the per diems in place as we have them now. Also keep the opt-in for the health insurance in place, and I think that could be more palatable to the public, which will have a lot to say and have had a lot to say about this bill. Again, just when I think that I can't get any more emails about certain bills, then another bill comes along, and this one right here, I've been kind of punished as far as with emails. And even though I probably don't support the S39 bill, you still have to answer the constituents' concerns. So I'd like to propose this amendment and would hope that the Senate would concur. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Addison.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the senator from Essex for alerting the Senate Government Operations to his intention to introduce this amendment. We met in a hurry over the lunch hour, and the committee voted to not support this amendment. Shortening the legislative session is a big conversation that involves a number of issues, including constitutional issues, staffing issues, administrative issues, and policy issues. And that is why the Senate Government Operations Committee in S39 proposed that such a discussion happen through a legislative study committee in the off session, and to bring back recommendations about many items, including the length of the session, after they've completed their work. So the Senate Government Operations Committee, again, does not support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Bennington.
Mr. President, I hear a lot of discussion about shortening the session as if it's an easy thing to do. I'm opposing the amendment, but I do want to speak a little bit to shortening a session. Right now, we are supposed to be the third branch of government, but we are not equal. We are in a position where the administration is much more able to deal with this. Years ago, I developed a relationship with the chair of the House Judiciary Committee in Texas. We had a lot of talks. Texas has a short session, but do you know that the committees meet year-round, developing bills, discussing bills, and working on it? So, I mean, I think that's something we don't do here, but if we want to shorten the session, you would find the committees would need to meet year-round. So I don't think we gain anything, although it sounds good when the governor says shorten the session. I don't think it works. So I'm going to vote no on this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Question is, shall the report of the Committee on Government Operations as amended be further amended as offered by the Senator from Essex? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
Nay.
The nays appear to have it. The nays do have it, and you have failed to further amend the report of the Committee on Government Operations. One moment, please. Before the next vote, I would just like to remind any senators who are attending remotely that when voting is taking place, the video is also supposed to be on according to the Senate rules for the vote to be included in the process. Question now is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Government Operations as amended? Are you ready for the question? If so, roll call is requested. I failed to see here. Who was it? Senator from Grand Isle. The question is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Government Operations as amended? Are you ready for the question? Senator from Madison.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't have much to add because my colleague from Windsor did an excellent, superb job of presenting this bill and the work of the Senate Government Operations Committee, and as backed up and reiterated by the Senate Pro Tem. I just want to thank them both for their excellent words on the floor about this bill. This bill, the Senate Government Operations Committee worked on for a number of reasons. One, because we heard the stories from so many of our colleagues, our former colleagues, and people who would like to be our colleagues in the Senate and the House, that they are not able to serve because of the structure of benefits and pay that we receive in the legislature. And I also thought it was very important that a committee of 5 women work on this, 5 women and 1 man work on this bill, because for a number of reasons. Many of you know that prior to my time in the Senate, I worked for an organization that trained and recruited women to run for public office. And I heard time and time again from women who wanted to be in public office that they could not afford to be in public office, that the barriers were too great for them. And even last year, when I was trying to recruit people to run for the Senate to replace my colleagues who were leaving, I heard time and time again that they could not do it because they couldn't lose their health insurance and they couldn't lose their ability to support their family. So I, as a more senior, I guess now I'm one of the more senior women in the Senate, felt that it was really important that we asked for a pay raise for the colleagues of ours that couldn't be here now, in the past, and in the future. And as the research shows repeatedly, women have a harder time asking for a pay raise. And I want to underscore that, as my colleagues have said, this is not us asking for a pay raise for ourselves, but the Senate Government Operations Committee, a committee of 5 women and 1 man, wanted to make sure that women saw us asking for a pay raise on their behalf. That this was important to make sure that our legislature represented all Vermonters, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of economic situation. And so, therefore, this was really important work for us. And even though it's not for our own pay raise, it was personal work for us. And I really hope that the Senate as a whole will support S39. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Government Operations as amended? Are you ready for that question? If so, the Secretary shall commence to call the roll.
Senator Baruch.
Yes.
Senator Bray.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
Yes.
Senator Campion.
No.
Senator Chittenden.
No with explanations.
Senator Clarkson.
Yes.
Senator Collmore.
No.
Senator Cummings.
Yes.
Senator Buick.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Senator Harrison.
Yes.
Senator Hashim.
Yes.
Senator Ingalls.
No.
Senator Kitchell.
No.
Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator McDonald.
Yes.
Senator Mazza.
No.
Senator McCormack.
Yes, with an explanation.
Senator Norris.
Yes.
Senator Persley.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale. Senator Sears.
No.
Senator Starr.
No.
Senator Bihowski.
Yes.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Wheat.
No.
Senator Westman.
Yes.
Senator White.
Yes.
Senator Williams.
No.
Senator Renner.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale.
Please listen to the results of your vote. Those voting yea, 19. Those voting nay, 10. And you have amended the bill as offered by the Committee on Government Operations as amended. Now for the two explanations of vote. First, the Senator from Chittenden Southeast, Senator Chittenden.
Sorry to use our time for this. It's just important for people to understand where we voted, and rather than bring another floor amendment, I figured I'd just tell you all now. I just have two issues with the bill. One, I don't agree with the adjournment compensation. I see if we're adjourned, then we shouldn't be paid. I see this as service and attending to those matters. If we're not in session, I don't see it as worth paying. The other concern I have is paying an average salary for the state, and I will put this all in writing for you. The other concern I have is I like getting to the average salary of the average Vermonter, but the average Vermonter doesn't get the meal stipend that we do. And so if we would drop the meal stipend and we paid to the average salary, I too could look my voters, constituencies in the eye and say that I could stand by this support. But those two things were enough for me to not support this bill in current form. It's second reading. If y'all want me to bring a floor amendment to third reading, I can do that. I'm trying to keep it light. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Windsor, Senator McCormack. Senator, your microphone is not on. We may need to turn you on here. I'll take a look and see if we can remedy that situation. Try now. We still are having difficulty. Hold on just a moment. Can you try to unmute now that we've also unmuted you on this end?
What about that?
We, Houston, we hear your messages. Apollo, you are welcome to explain your vote.
I'm proud to vote yes for this bill simply on its merits, but with a special emphasis in behalf of all single parents, in particular in honor of my two sons, who were raised by in part, segregated by a single father. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question now, just to be clear, the prior vote was to amend the bill. The vote now is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question?
Roll call.
Roll call's been requested. Was that the same senator?
Yes.
Senator from Grand Isle. Senator from Orange.
Mr. President, we've discussed one of the basic truths of this discussion is it takes courage for legislators to ask or call for a pay increase. And I wanted to share with you the first time that it came up when I was in the legislature. It was in the other body, Mr. President. And contribution was perhaps naive because I said, for those of us that serve here, because of our spouses can afford to have us serve here, I think we ought to have a pay increase. And that was probably 30 years ago. You don't get many times when this comes up when you're in the legislature. And I thought I had done the right thing. Well, I caught unshirted hell for that in the hours afterwards as the women in the legislature came over and castigated me for my remarks. And I had to explain one at a time that I was serving because my wife was the one that made the income, and that made it possible for me to serve. And I wasn't. Today, if you look around in both the other body and here in the Senate, we see more women here who serve in their own right and perhaps have some that have, like my wife, made it possible for me to serve. And Mr. President, I also, I wanted to say something this week because I never would have run for office if my mother hadn't run for office and gotten elected, which she did in her own right. And the reason I wanted to mention it this week was that it was 40 years ago this week that my mother died as a result of an automobile accident, driving to the Vermont House to serve her first term after having been elected. And I have no doubt that I never would have served in this legislature if it hadn't been for her efforts and for having been elected. I was appointed to fill her seat. And when it came time to campaign, I was, it was kind of a scary proposition. And my campaign door to door was that I'm not as smart as my mother. And obviously people recognize that. And I think I got elected on her coattails. We're better off when we have people who come in their own right to serve. And I was counting up the number of women who would have given me unshirted hell today if I had made the same remarks I did years back. And I don't know if I'll be around to collect any of the benefits that are forthcoming and long overdue. But this is the right thing to do for the people of the state, and you probably won't be thanked for it, but you should be thanked for it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Rutland.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I interrogate the reporter of the bill?
The reporter of the bill from Government Operations, or the reporter of the bill as amended by Senator from Windsor is interrogated as a reporter of the bill.
So first, my appreciation to Senator from Windsor for eloquent delivery. I do have just one simple question. So in the bill, there's a suggestion to create legislative service working group to evaluate compensation for both houses. but there's also, the bill contains a set of very significant solutions. And I'm wondering what the concept was between recommending establishing a working group and already establishing solutions. Why not wait for the results of the working group?
Thank you, Mr. President, for that question. We heard the crisis situation that has occurred with legislators who are unable to serve now. So we want to stem the flow of the crisis situation we're experiencing, where Vermonters who want to serve now are unable to do so. We also rested on a series of reports, including the Snelling report, which was done back in 2005, which outlined the need to go to the average Vermont wage. So we have had a study on that concept in the past. It also recommended the out-of-session pay for 1 day, and we felt that we had those components addressed in the Snelling report. And further, we did feel that there were more conversations that we needed to have, and that is why we both have solutions in this bill, as is often the case in our legislation, and a committee or a working group to look further at them.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I inquire of the reporter of the bill with a short introduction to my query?
You can either do the introduction and then inquire, but as soon as you inquire, Senator will stand and be standing while you do your introduction. It's up to you which you prefer to do.
I will inquire.
Senator from Windsor is interrogated as a reporter of the bill.
I'm curious, as someone who believes in strengthening our democracy, but is also dismayed by the amount of time and money that we in the United States spend campaigning, if the committee took any testimony or had any discussions around the difference between work versus constituent outreach versus campaigning. We talked briefly about this today when we were outside during the alarm system, whatever that was, but and we talked about what is the definition of campaigning versus work, et cetera. So I'm curious about that.
Thank you, Mr. President. We did not discuss a definitional difference between campaigning and legislating, although we did discuss what it would mean for an incumbent who might be serving to be running for re-election. I would say to answer your question around, I think what I'm hearing is a concern that someone would be being paid with the 1/5 off time and then campaigning during that time, if I'm understanding the concern properly. And I would say that we have the same situation during the legislative session now, where you could be doing legislative work during the session and could be also campaigning. And I would hold that we are a group of individuals who see public service as our goal, and that we have a legislative, we have an oath, we have ethics, and I find it unlikely that a person who is getting the 1/5 time would be using that for exclusive campaign events. And we would also be putting in our time. It's the same way we would do the vision system now. So if you were to be not properly using the time, I think that we would be able to see that.
You can thank the person you were interrogating so that they could sit down. That would be good.
Thank you.
The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, the secretary shall commence to call the roll.
Senator Ruth.
Yes.
Senator Bray.
Yes.
Senator Brock.
Yes.
Senator Campion.
No.
Senator Chittenden.
No.
Senator Clarkson.
Yes.
Senator Collmore.
No.
Senator Cummings.
Yes.
Senator Buick.
Yes.
Senator Hardy.
Yes.
Senator Harrison.
Yes.
Senator Hashim.
Yes.
Senator Ingalls.
No.
Senator Kitchell. Senator Lyons.
Yes.
Senator McDonald.
Yes.
Senator Mazza. No. Senator McCormack.
Yes.
Senator Norris.
Yes.
Senator Pershing.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale. Senator Sears.
No.
Senator Starr.
No.
Senator Bihowski.
Yes.
Senator Watson.
Yes.
Senator Wheat.
No.
Senator Westman.
Yes.
Senator White.
Yes.
Senator Williams.
No.
Senator Renner.
Yes.
Senator Ron Hinsdale.
Please listen to the results of your vote. Those voting yea, 19. Those voting nay, 10. And you have ordered third reading of S39. That now brings us to H41. H41 was introduced and referred to the Committee on Judiciary, which recommends that when the bill is amended, the bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H41, an act relating to referral of domestic and sexual violence cases to community justice centers.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report from the Committee on Judiciary, the Senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. This bill actually comes from a 2018 act of the legislature where we asked for a study on restorative justice practices, and was issued on July 1, 2019. And the executive summary of the bill was that the Act 146 Study Committee was created by Vermont General Assembly to examine the potential for using restorative justice approaches to domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking. The committee made recommendations back in 2019 that programmatic criteria for programs offering restorative justice intervention to address domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking should be formalized by a body or agency that is authorized to create readiness criteria, provide support and technical assistance, and offer oversight. The report further went on to discuss the voluntary engagement by offenders and victims, a defined approach based on evidence on established body of knowledge, facilitators who are trained in the dynamics of domestic violence, sexual violence, and/or stalking, facilitators who are trained in restorative justice principles and approaches, and demonstrated trauma-informed program elements. Formalized relationships with community-based domestic and/or sexual violence advisory programs, transparency with participants about limits of confidentiality and privacy, and defined opportunities for victim choice and voice throughout the process, and a plan for an evaluation and continued improvement. So, Mr. President, H41 takes those that report and puts it into legislation. But first, let me describe a case from Bennington that might help us understand how it might work. So there was a man who was charged with and convicted of domestic violence on his ex-wife. Working with the victim's advocate and this man who delivered furniture for one of our local furniture stores, there were accommodations made that he would seek treatment, that he would go through diversion, that he would do all these things. So he kept his job, paid child support, paid taxes, and there were no further problems. That's the idea behind H41. It is only when the victim says it's okay, does this happen? It is victim-centered. So I want to be clear. It also takes a memorandum of understanding, and I'll get into the details of the bill, but it's important to understand what we're proposing in H41. Section 1 directs the Community Justice Unit of the Office of Attorney General to provide support to the community justice centers for domestic violence and sexual violence case referrals. Cases prohibited creates an exception to the prohibition against sending domestic violence and sexual assault cases to community justice centers in accordance with Section 3 of the bill. Section 3 of the bill permits domestic violence and social and sexual assault cases to be referred to CJ, the community justice centers, provided the community justice center has a current and executed memorandum of understanding with a local member organization of the Vermont Network against domestic and sexual violence. Further, the section directs the Community Justice Unit in consultation with the Vermont Network and the Center for Crime Victim Services to create guidance for memorandums of understanding on or before July 1, 2024. The memorandums of understanding must include the protocols that establish a defined approach based on evidence or established promising program. And you'll note that these are basically the same as what was in the 2019 report. Prioritize victim safety, include voluntary referral and participation by parties, require initial and annual training for relevant community justice center staff, facilitators, and volunteers. And our amendment that I'll get to in a little while adds to that group who would get the training. Establish roles and participation of the Community Justice Center, local domestic and sexual violence organization, and other community partners as needed. Establish written confidentiality standards that ensure constitutional protections and the privacy of participants. Establish universal data collection standards developed by the Community Justice Unit, and establish written annual evaluation and quality improvement plan and processes that engage community and system stakeholders.
But if you,
there is much more in there, but I
want to
think,
fall asleep, because that's what I want to do right now. So.
I don't think that's part of my report.
I think we'll pause for a moment until we get this clarified. All set? Senator, you can continue.
Thank you very
You're
much.
quite the ventriloquist.
It's important to note there's a Public Records Act exemption in the bill. Any records or information produced or required pursuant to the Community Justice Center process must be kept confidential and is exempt from Vermont Public Records Act. However, a Community Justice Center may disclose the information to colleges, universities, public agencies, the state, and nonprofit research organizations that a Community Justice Center agency has agreements with for the use in connection with research projects of a public service nature. And then Section 4 involves reports, and you will see that I will go through those in an amendment in a few minutes. And we have an effective date, which is on passage. Your committee heard from Lance Burnham, Vermont State Police, Department of Public Safety, Michelle Childs, wonderful legislative counsel, Office of Legislative Counsel, Aaron Jacobson, Co-Director of Community Justice Diversion for the Attorney General's Office, Rachel Jolly from the Community Justice Centers, Timothy Lauders Dumont, Legislative and Assistant Appellate Attorney with the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, Darrell Meadowink, Restorative and Community Justice Executive Department of Corrections, Marshall Paul, Senator General, Jennifer Pullman, Executive Director, Center for Crime Victim Services, and Sarah Robinson, Deputy Director of Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. All of those folks supported the bill, with the exception of Mr. Burnham from Vermont State Police. He never commented one way or the other on the bill. He did have a suggested amendment. that, Mr. President? May I go on to the amendment, or should I wait?
The committee report, I believe, is the amendment, indeed, so continue.
Mr. President, the amendment involves first, in section 1, the relationship of the Justice Centers with state government entities. And what we do is change section 1B, support from the Office of Attorney General, the Community Justice Unit, the Office of Attorney General shall provide to the Community Justice Centers support for domestic violence and sexual violence case referrals in accordance with section 1968 of this title. That's the first part of our amendment. Excuse me, I'm in the wrong. I apologize, Mr. President, I was reading from the bill.
Well, the amendment can be found on page 1362 of today's calendar.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize to the Senate. This amendment the first amendment has to do with adding to those who are part of section 3 study. As I mentioned earlier, it adds to that study by the relevant law enforcement and prosecutors. The second amendment deals with the reports, and your Senate Judiciary Committee is looking for more than just the memorandums of understanding. And if you look towards the end of the first report and the end of the second, you'll say programming and referrals, sources, available data on effectiveness, and the available resources and capacity for such programming. And you see similar language in the second in B, and those are our changes. The committee vote on the changes was 5-0-0, I believe, and the committee vote was 5-0-0. We urge the Senate to adopt H41 as amended.
The question is, shall the Senate amend the report as offered by the Committee on Judiciary? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have amended the report as offered by the Committee on Judiciary. The question now is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and you have ordered third reading of H41. We now have up for consideration H53. H53 was read for the first time, referred to the Committee on Judiciary, which considered the same and recommends that when amended, the bill ought to pass. The bill is then referred to the Committee on Finance that also recommended that when amended, the bill ought to pass. Please listen to the second reading of the bill.
H53, an act relating to driver's license suspensions.
Now you've heard the second reading of the bill. For the report from the Committee on Judiciary, the Senator from Chittenden Central, Senator Vyhovsky.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I speak to the underlying bill as well as the amendment?
You may.
Thank you. This really is a simple little bill. It will eliminate the suspension of driver's licenses or the privilege to operate exclusively for the non-payment of traffic violations. In 2016, the General Assembly eliminated license suspensions for non-payment of non-moving violations, like parking tickets. This bill would expand the elimination of license suspensions for non-payment to also include moving violations. To be clear, this bill will not prevent the license suspension for actual violations like a DUI or point accumulation or the non-payment of child support, but only if someone gets a citation that they're unable to or have not paid, their license would then not be suspended. We heard that this will affect about 4,000 drivers and is largely meant to ensure that people are not further penalized for being unable to pay a fine by making their means of getting to and from their workplace or other responsibilities impossible. Anyone who currently has their license suspended for failure to pay a fine will not be impacted by this change. The amendment that was made in your Senate Judiciary Committee was to the effective date. We heard from the Department of Motor Vehicles that it would take about 21 days to stop the current suspensions in process. And so the effective date of this bill is 30 days after passage to give the department time to halt the current process. We did hear from JFO that the fiscal impact would be somewhat negligible to the Department of Motor Vehicles, but I will let the Finance Committee tell us more about that. We heard from the Chief of Trial Court Operations at the Vermont Judiciary, Legislative Counsel at the Office of Legislative Counsel, the Director of the Court Diversion and Pretrial Services, the Deputy Defender General and Chief Juvenile Defender at the Defender General's Office, the Senior Fiscal Analyst at the Joint Fiscal Office, and the Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Motor Vehicles. And your Committee on Judiciary voted 5-0-0 and asked for the body's support. Thank you.
Now, if they're board from Committee on Finance, Senator from Chittenden, Southeast, Senator Chittenden.
Thank you, Mr. President. JAFO estimates this bill would have a fiscal impact of approximately $200,000 in foregone annual revenue to the Transportation Fund due to fewer license reinstatement fees. According to JFO, note, there were about 12,770 suspensions imposed in 2022 here in Vermont. Those went to about 9,251 unique individuals. That generated about $423,000 out of our total $300 million transportation fund from all state tax revenues. This bill, this is an important point that we talked about in Senate Finance, this bill will only eliminate reinstatement fees for about 43% of those suspensions. Just moving violations like speeding, rolling through a stop sign, running a red light. License suspensions will continue to happen for some behavioral offenses, accumulating 10 or more points, driving while under influence, or so on. The bill effectively eliminates an $80 driver's license reinstatement fee from hitting about 4,000 Vermonters each year who fail to pay a moving violation ticket within 30 days of getting the citation. And so for the record, if the press is still here, we are reducing some fees here, which is good. We have approximately 80 moving violations with points assessed defined in Chapter 23, Subchapter 2502. These moving violations range from failure to obey traffic control signals to driving over a fire hose. I could read them all, but something tells me you wouldn't appreciate that. But important to note that this reinstatement fee will still be collected for driver's license suspensions that happen in Vermont for negligent operation driving offenses like driving under the influence, driving recklessly, or accumulating 10 or more points. So this reinstatement fee is not being eliminated. It just won't be triggered when people don't pay their speeding ticket within 30 days. Speeding ticket. Your Senate Finance Committee heard from our Senator Sears and Thea Dexter Cooper, Legislative Counsel, Chris Roop with the Joint Fiscal Office, and your Senate Finance Committee considered the cost in lost revenue relative to the types of moving violations this bill relates to and voted 6-0-1 in support of its passage. We encourage this Senate to concur. Thank you, Mr. President.
Question is, shall the bill be amended as offered by the Committee on Judiciary? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you have amended the bill as offered by the Committee on Judiciary. The question now is, shall the bill be read a third time? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed indicate by saying nay.
Nay.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it, and you have ordered third reading of H53. That completes the orders of the day. Senator from Chittenden Central.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pending announcements, of which I have one, I would move that the Senate stand in adjournment until Friday, April 14th at 11:30 a.m.
Senator from Chittenden Central has moved that pending announcements stand adjournment until Friday, April 14th at 11:30 a.m. Are there any announcements, Senator from Chittenden Central?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 63 years ago today, a star, a very bright star, appeared in the sky over Rutland. And the people at Jones's Donuts were sore afraid. But it turned out okay. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy that one day a wise man would come forward to lead the Senate in the capacity of our Senate Secretary. That man, John Bloom, is experiencing his 63rd birthday even as we speak. Please give him a hand. With that said, Mr. President, I would defer to my colleague from Windsor, who I believe has a few additional comments.
Senator from Windsor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Okay, there are a lot of remarkable people who were born or who died, and incredible historic events that happened on this day in history. But I have to say that and we did not actually coordinate this, but to complement the pro tem's remarks, I would say hallelujah for John Bloomer.
Are there any further announcements? Senator from Washington.
I hate to follow that, Mr. President, but Senate Finance will need to follow the gavel. We have witnesses waiting.
Hallelujah. Senator from Madison.
Thank you, Mr. President. Likewise, Senator GovOps has witnesses waiting, so we will need to follow the gavel.
Senator from Bennington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Education, give 5 minutes after the floor.
Senator from Essex.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hallelujah, Secretary Moore. And Senate institutions will meet 15 minutes after the following gavel.
Are there any further announcements? Senator from Windsor.
On all these notes, I will remind the Senate that tonight is Cabaret, and you can get your tickets from Senator Harrison, a mere $20 to support the Vermont Food Bank. And I would encourage all of us to be practicing. We now have several Senate skits. And again, it's not a competition with the House, but we look forward to both an audience of the Senate and honor all the participants, and happy cabaret and birthday.
Senator from Madison.
Thanks, Mr. President. Senate Natural Resources will meet tomorrow morning at 8:30.
Are there any further announcements? I'll just say, Senator Bloomer, or Secretary Bloomer, although it is your birthday, if the light is still on, the rule still stands. Are there any further announcements? If not, the senator from Chittenden Central has moved that the Senate stand adjourned until Friday, April 14th at 11:30 a.m. Are you ready for the question? If so, all those in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the Senate will stand adjourned until Friday, April 14th at 11:30 a.m.